Remember, Bunyan's pastor has died a few years before this, his favorite friend, and his previous wife has died. And here he has this blind daughter. He has all of those things that are afflictions to him too. And he understands that he's walking a narrow road and going to home. He's going to heaven, to this celestial city. And when I'm going to go through a few of the passages in the Bible where people have suffered, kind of memorable suffering in the Bible, and I want you to think about how their suffering probably dwarfs yours, but it doesn't minimize yours. You know, you have suffering, and it's real suffering. When you lie awake in the middle of the night and can't sleep, when your mind is distraught and overwhelmed, and you're absolutely confused, and these, he calls them the clouds of confusion, and thoughts of death hang over you. You're not the first one. You're not the only one. We all go through those things sometimes where we're just absolutely tormented. And the only thing I can say to you is to do what the character in the story does, which is you have to stick to the narrow way, and you have to know that God's presence will guide you through the darkness. Now, I'm going to tell you that the second part of the valley of the shadow of death, he sees in light, and the second part that he can see is worse than the first part, which he can't see, which he's passing through in absolute darkness. But it's our life that's like this. Leaving this world and going to the next one isn't the problem. Getting through this world is the problem. Okay? So I'm going to show you what happens with Bunyan here, and we'll go from there with the Christian examples from the Scripture. Christian then said, Christian, I perceive not yet by what you have said, but that this is my way to the desired haven. You see, we still have this reiteration of what he said previously, that this way of trouble, this way of trial, this way of trembling, this way of sorrow, this way of affliction and heartache and heartbreak, this is normal life. This is the way that pilgrims walk through this world. This is the way this world treats pilgrims. And pilgrims are supposed to want to get out of this world of trouble and into that world where there is no trouble, that haven, as he calls it, which we call heaven. Okay, so let's take a look at the first of these biblical characters, and it's going to be Job. I don't know how familiar you are with the story of Job, so I'm going to give you just a brief background on it. Here's what it says about Job. He lives in the land of Uz. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household. So this man was the greatest of all the people in the East, a very wealthy man, and a very godly man. And the way the story is told in Job is kind of a curious form. We learn of this Satan approaching God. He's called a son of God in here, meaning a creature or an angel. And what we really learn by we get to the end of Job is that God allows people to be afflicted by Satan for wise reasons. Sometimes God lets you know the wise reasons, sometimes he doesn't. In this case, there's this imaginative sort of conversation. I doubt that it was a literal conversation, but for our understanding, it works like this. Satan is saying to God, if you just wouldn't put a hedge around this Job, he'd never fear you. He wouldn't worship you if he was ever suffering in any kind of way. It's just that you've done nothing but prosper him. It's very easy for Job to profess to love you because his life is very easy and he's very wealthy. So God allows Satan, he says, behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person. So God permits Satan. Now we learn then that Satan can't do anything on his own without God's permission. He is, as Christians have historically understood it, He's a dog on a chain, but he's a dog that's let loose to run to the end of his chain. Why? Well, because God's decided that's best. I don't know why, but that's certainly the story in Job, the understanding you gain. Now, remember how wealthy he was with all these thousands of sheep and hundreds of camels and donkeys. Now, there was a day. His sons and his daughters are eating, and here a messenger comes to Job and says, the oxen were plowing, the donkeys feeding beside them. The Sabaeans raided them and took them away. So he loses the oxen and the donkeys. Well, pretty soon, there's another servant shows up and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned the sheep and the servants. I alone survived. While he was still speaking, another servant comes and says, the Chaldeans raided here and took the camels and all of them and killed all the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone survived. While he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking in their oldest brother's house. Suddenly a great wind came and struck the four corners of the house. It fell on the young people, and all of your children have died, and I alone survived to tell you this. Well, that's a bad day. You lose all of your children. You lose all of your livestock. Everything that could go wrong happened to this poor man, this good man. Why? God permitted Satan to do it. It happened in a day. So, in your life, there's two things you need to remember. When God permits Satan to afflict you, there's a reason for it, but he's permitting him to. He does nothing without permission. He is a dog on a chain. Secondly, the dog on the chain would do as much damage to you as he could if God permitted it. Now, you might waste your time telling me that you don't think it ought to work that way. I'm not much interested in whether you think it ought to work that way. I'm trying to give you an understanding of how it does work. I wasn't too pleased to learn this myself, but it is this way, and you have to adapt to it. God's not about to adapt to you. Now, here's Job's famous speech upon receiving this news. He tears his robe off, shaves his head, falls to the ground, and he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all of this, and this is very important, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. How would he have sinned? By charging God with wrong. Had Job said, well, the Lord's not good. No good God could allow this to happen. That is something somebody says to me virtually every day. If God were any good, he wouldn't allow this injustice in the world. If God were any good, my mother wouldn't have died. If God were any good, my daughter wouldn't have died. My husband, you substitute the person. And they'll say that to me boldly, but they sin when they do it. Now, I'm very understanding of it because I know that that's their perception of freedom that they have. But you see, Job, who was wise, said, the Lord gave, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And then it commends Job for not sinning. Well, in this story, what happens is Satan reappears. He says to God, Job didn't sin against you, but if you allowed me to touch his person, he would. And God says, fine, do so. And of course, this is a real test of Job's faith. And this is what happens. He tells him that you can do whatever you want with him, just spare his life. So verse 7 of chapter 2, Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And the boils were so bad think about it, from the top of his head to the sole of his feet, covered with boils, that he takes a potsherd, from the field and tries to scrape the boils off. Yeah. How could you walk? How could you stay awake? How could you fall asleep? Job is suffering agony, and his wife, his beloved wife, says to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. She says, why would you continue to say, God gives and God takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord? Curse God and die. It's so miserable to watch somebody in such agony as Job must have been. And he says, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? And all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now you think about that. In all of this, with boils from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head, he didn't sin with his lips, even though his wife encouraged him when she should have been somebody discouraging him from such a crazy thing as sinning against God. If you're suffering, as you probably are in one way or another, I challenge you to do as Job did and keep your mouth shut. Don't charge God with doing wickedly. Don't say God isn't good. God is eternally, infinitely good, even in your suffering, even through your suffering, even if your suffering includes tragedy in your life. It doesn't change the goodness of God. Emulate Job, and we'll all prove to be better sons and daughters of the Most High.
As I traveled on my journey, few and
Poor Job,
far
he suffers greatly, the loss of everything, all of his children, all of his goods. And then what you begin to see is his friends show up, and they reproach him. They accuse him of being sinful. Their take on life is that when you suffer, you must have sinned for God to punish you. Well, you can see in Job's case, that isn't true. In some cases, it is true. David said in Psalm 119, before I was afflicted, I went astray. So in David's case, God afflicted him because he did go astray. In Job's case, God afflicted him and he didn't go astray. So it doesn't give you a license to go to somebody's home and say, you must have sinned. Eliphaz does that to poor Job, and it's just not true. So please keep that in mind when you're doing it. It may be true, but it isn't. Now, when you come again next week, we're going to get back to the allegory that Bunyan's saying about the valley of the shadow of death, and we'll look at some more people, David in particular, who suffered anguish, and maybe you can identify with David's anguish, and we'll see how that fits into Bunyan's life and his character Christian as he on his way to the celestial city. Come back next week, please. Thanks.
I got a mother done gone on. I got a mother done gone on. Makes me feel like my time ain't long. I got a mother done gone on. Got a mother done gone on. It makes me feel like my time ain't long. Well, the bell keep a tolling and tolling. The bell keep a tolling and tolling. Make me feel like my time ain't long. No, the bell keep a tolling, child, the bell keep a tolling. It makes me feel like my time ain't long. Well, I got a father gone on. I got a father gone on. Makes me feel like my time ain't long. Father and gone on. Father and gone on. Make me feel like my time ain't long. The hearse keeper rolling. The hearse keeper rolling, and that make me feel like my time ain't long. Lordy, Lord, well, the hearse keeper rolling, the hearse keeper rolling, keep me feel like my time ain't no